Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I was thinking that this is my second time to Oregon, and every time I come, I'm thrilled because my son was a fantastic cross-country and track runner when he was growing up. He and 3 other people broke their high school record when he was a sophomore, and their inspiration was Prefontaine. And so I'm wondering if the Rotary Action Group for Peace will be the Prefontaine for peace for the world. What I'd like to talk about today are 5 things, and we'll go over very quickly the approach to conflict early warning and early response, which is something that the world has been trying to get right for years. I want to talk a little bit about the reasons I believe that Al and I started looking at this question, the conversation that I had with him. I want to talk about some of the unique, which have already been addressed to some extent, the unique capacities of Rotary. I want to outline what I think Rotary needs to do to proceed down this path of peace building. And then I also want to address some of the challenges that I think are going to be there that you need to deal with and to plan for. So let's start out here with the whole idea of conflict early warning and early response. Many of you probably remember the failed state initiative that Vice President Al Gore was involved with. And the whole idea there was you could analyze certain indicators of poverty, of inequality, of rule of law and injustice, and that those indicators could help us see where there was likely to be violence in the world, which countries were likely to go into meltdown mode or to fail. And the idea was as we identified those countries, we could then develop programs to intervene and prevent those countries from going into meltdown mode. Well, in fact, what's happened is that there have been some really wonderful early warning systems that have been created, but the early response, has typically not been forthcoming. It's been frankly, it's been a disappointment. It was as if the social scientist dreamers, you might even say those who are plagued with post-Enlightenment hubris, and the innovative bureaucrats and diplomats and foreign policy experts came together to envision this idea of early warning and early response. And it was at pretty high levels. It was at the level of the UN, the level of the US State Department, et cetera, et cetera. And sadly, even though there were warnings, the responses didn't follow. One of the best warning systems was the one developed by Swiss Peace Foundation, FAST. It's no longer funded. It was supported for years. The group that I worked with in Sri Lanka was supported by the Swiss Peace Foundation. But the government of Sweden felt like the warnings were not being used. They were not being heeded. And to a large extent, it's not a mystery as to why. I mean, the reason, frankly, is because it's very difficult for people to marshal the kind of political support they need to deploy peacekeepers and to do so quickly. And particularly for democracies, usually there has to be a crisis before there is enough political will to take action. And by definition, early warning and early response is designed to prevent a disaster rather than to respond to one. So just structurally, it hasn't worked out the way that we thought it would. I mean, certainly there have been some examples when it's been done. The British intervened in Sierra Leone. It's kind of a unique case. We have a lot of hope that it can still work. And I would say that based on the work of Rotary and other groups, I think it's clear, it's obvious that it can't be purely a governmental phenomenon. It can't be a UN phenomenon. It has to involve people in the private sector if it's going to work. And that's primarily because of the need for local capacity. And we'll talk about that more as we go along. Okay, this is Sri Lanka. I'm sure you know Sri Lanka is right south of India. It's a beautiful island. It is considered by many Buddhists the Golden Kingdom. The overwhelming population within Sri Lanka is Buddhist of the Sinhalese ethnicity. The minority is Tamil, many of whom are Hindu, some of whom are Muslim and Christian. And I'm putting this map up because this is the map that I struggled with when I was working with the Asia Foundation, working with an organization in Sri Lanka called Foundation for Coexistence. And they had set up an early warning and an early response program based in the capital city, Colombo, which is in the yellow part of the map here. And they were focused predominantly on the eastern province of Sri Lanka, which is to your right. The red part, the eastern province, consisted of Trincomalee, Batticaloa, and Ampara. And they were keeping track of tension and cooperation in that part of Sri Lanka primarily. They subsequently started working on other parts. But there was a breakaway group from the main Tamil Tiger group. Many of you have read about the LTTE in Sri Lanka, the Tamil Tigers. They had broken away. It was a separatist revolt. And all of the Tamils were a part of that revolt. But at one point, I believe it was in 2004, there was a subgroup of the Tamil Tigers that asserted autonomy from the main group of Tamil Tigers. And it's called the Karuna Rebellion, named after Colonel Karuna. And that became a bloody condition. The people in the north didn't appreciate the people in the east trying to break away from them. And so not only was there tension and conflict between the government of Sri Lanka on the one hand and the Tamil Tigers on the other, there was Tamil against Tamil violence. And it was a very sad evolution of the conflict. When I was going to the east, and I didn't spend a whole lot of time there, but I did spend time in Trincomalee and Batticaloa. We rode over to meet with some of the staff members and many of the partner organizations in those parts of the eastern province. And I noticed Rotary signs as I was driving down the road. And so here I am, I'm working with a group that's working on early warning and early response, and I'm thinking, you know, the people of different identities really need to start figuring out how to cooperate with one another and figuring out how to tame down the hotheads among them. And all of a sudden I see Rotary International, Sinhalese group, meets at this time. Rotary International, Tamil group, meets at this time. Now, I'm not trying to be critical of the Rotary in Sri Lanka. What I was surprised by was that Rotary, this organization that has civic glue, it is glue for many of these countries, it was bifurcating along ethnic lines. And it just broke my heart. So when I saw Al and he asked me about Rotary, and I said, oh, so you're a Rotarian, I told him about what I had seen in Sri Lanka. And that's the reason I'm standing here in front of you today. So what is unique about Rotary? I talked already about the civic glue, but you know, typically, and you know, I think there's no secret to the fact that Rotary typically has some of the most prominent individuals within its organization. You know, people who are prominent in business, politics, all sectors of society. They regularly interact. What is it, once a month there's a Rotary meeting? Once a week, okay. Even better, 4 times more. I've attended Rotary meetings a number of times, and it just amazes me how well people know each other. Again, the civic glue is there, pulling people together who are of different identities, different interest groups, etc. And this is something that I can't resist walking over here. I know Patrick doesn't want me to, but I thought of this word. I was working on this morning, and this word kept coming up. Rotary has the audacity to think that it can eliminate polio. Rotary has the audacity to think that it can bring peace to the world. And thank God for Rotary. It's almost done it with polio. I mean, we've got 3 countries where it's still a problem: Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Nigeria. But an organization like Rotary, with its prominence, with its regular interaction, with people who have the audacity to dream, and then to do it, and then to fund it. They don't just talk about it. They do it and they fund it. So to me, Rotary has a lot going for it that maybe no other organization in the world has going for it. So I really like kind of the theme today is audacity, okay? That's our main theme. Now, when we talk about Rotary's unique position, we need to keep in mind that really what's needed for early warning and early response is not just the top level thing. You know, the failed state initiative, that was at the very top levels of government and of the UN and a lot of transnational organizations. And what is really required, as we've looked at what works with early warning and early response, is that there needs to be a multi-level capacity. It needs to be at the top, in the middle, and at the local level, the so-called grassroots, where civil society organizations, community-based organizations, service organizations work together along with people at the mid-level and at the top level to prevent violence from happening, to try to build a more just society, a more equitable society, while at the same time having the ability to intervene quickly if there's a problem. If it's got to be quick, it's probably not going to happen through the top level. I mean, that's what we've learned through our years of conflict early warning and early response. Okay, so the multi-level, and this is really the most important point, I think, about the capacity for Rotary to operate. It can operate at all levels because of its prominence. It can influence people at all levels because of its prominence. And it's got groups, it has members throughout the country, in places all over the world at the local level. So it can handle both the horizontal and the vertical. And if you don't have both of those, it's not going to work. It's not, you know, sometimes people talk about, well, it's just the grassroots. We need to focus on the grassroots. Well, that isn't true. Just focusing on the grassroots doesn't work. You need people at the mid-level and the top level who can exercise their authority to have influence in turning around these problems. At the same time, at the top level, it doesn't work either. We need both. So it's both the vertical and the horizontal. Now, it's also outsiders and insiders. And what's happening is that, you know, in the past, there were the outsiders at the top level who were trying to do early warning and early response, and they would try to work with some of the insiders at the top level to do it. And what we're seeing is that we need all levels. But what's really fascinating is that, you know, Rotary International is exactly that. It's international. So people from the outside can be involved in supporting people on the inside. I mean, we're even seeing now that people, they're calling themselves volunteer and technical communities. These are, you know, many of them college students, techno-whiz kids who are involved in supporting local people to understand how to respond to violence using internet-based platforms like Ushahidi, which is something that we can talk about more, but it's a digital map that allows people to plot events or assets on it and also to see trends over time. And so people, rather than the local level, I call that the cyberspace level. People from all over the world work in solidarity with vulnerable people on the ground using platforms like Ushahidi. And there's no reason, in fact, I would say that there's every reason for Rotary to be plugged in at all levels, but including the cyberspace level. You know, people on the ground, the clubs on the ground who can keep track of what's going on in their communities, and people on the outside who can be working with them in solidarity with incredibly useful situational awareness through a platform like Ushahidi. And Ushahidi, you can Google it. There's a crowd-based system right now. It's called CrowdMap. It's a crowd-based version of Ushahidi. It's all free. It's open source. And oftentimes they get people reporting events and about assets, events of conflict and events of cooperation, and they place those onto the maps, and those maps can be seen by anybody. It's an incredible capacity that's been developed. Now, I'm using religion here because, you know, ethnicity and religion are both factors that are often used for demarcating groups of people. And years ago, the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict, I thought, pointed out a really useful insight. And that is to say that people of one group need to be the ones who engage with the extremists of that group. It doesn't work real well, for instance, to have a Christian telling a militant Muslim that they shouldn't be militant. It doesn't work very well to have a moderate Jew telling a militant Christian not to be militant. It should be Christian to Christian, Muslim to Muslim, whatever the identity group is. People of the same group, particularly when theology is involved and belief is involved. When you get into a dialogue on the basis of that belief, of that theology, it needs to be people of the same identity working with each other. So I came up with this architecture. I call this, you know, the communication architecture. And the white dots are dots of the moderates. The darker dots are the more extremists. So you have co-religionist gatekeeping. A friend of mine, Rick McCulley, and I call it that. You know, you're holding the gate to the theology. You're holding the gate to the major thrust of a religious tradition, and you're making sure that certain segments of a sacred text or certain parts of a tradition are not being abused by the extremists. And so you have co-religionists engaging in a conversation, in dialogue, not people from the outside, but co-religionists. And you also are able to monitor what is aggressive by, as indicated by the darker arrows, because aggression is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, sometimes you don't realize that you've just offended somebody because you're not a part of their culture. You don't have the same religious tradition, the same experience as they do. So there needs to be a network of people. You know, the white dots. There needs to be a network of those people who work together to prevent violence. That's a Rotary Club. The white dots are a Rotary Club. And they communicate every week. They're with each other every week. They the ones from different groups can interact with the people who are causing trouble, the troublemakers. Sometimes the troublemakers, you know, I don't want to demonize them. Sometimes the troublemakers have a really good point to make. There's injustice. You know, we need reform. Our government is not working right. You know, and it's a question of engaging with them and coming up with nonviolent ways to address injustice as compared to violent ways. And that's the important point that I want to make today. This is about engagement. It's not about shunning. It's about transforming, not eliminating. It's about working with people who see the world differently, who are struggling with some sort of pain, some sort of perceived injustice. Maybe a family member of theirs has been harmed or killed, and they're carrying that with them. This is not about we're smart and they're stupid. This is about we need to talk with them and learn from them just like we hope that they can learn from us. the extremists are not people to be shunned. We've got to engage with them. I mean, that's what we see over and over. If we don't engage with them, then it just becomes, you know, either incarcerate or become violent. We have to keep in mind that the way to make peace is by engaging with people who do not necessarily want peace. So how can the Rotarians proceed? These people who have the audacity to think that they can bring peace to the world. The people who had the audacity to dream that polio could be eliminated. I would say, first of all, that a secretariat is needed. It needs to be an international one. You know, Chicago, Portland, maybe Nairobi. I keep joking with people that Nairobi is the Silicon Valley of Africa. Ushahidi was created in Nairobi by a bunch of journalists who were responding to the post-election violence, 2007, 2008. Some of the most dynamic enterprises now, social change enterprises that use computer platforms, are being developed in Africa. And Nairobi is the nucleus of that. There needs to be some sort of a risk assessment. You know, methodologically, in the world of conflict early warning and early response, risk assessment is different than early warning. Risk assessment is more like the failed state initiative, where you assess the risk of different countries going into meltdown mode. Early warning is, if we don't do something, there's going to be violence within a day or two. Okay, so they're really different. At a macro level, at an international level, you can do risk assessment. The Rotarian Action Group for Peace could form a secretariat to assess where the threats to peace are, the greatest threats. They could rank order them. Every month they could re-rank order them, because there will be new events, there will be new changes that are found out, and they could focus on those countries and prioritize where Rotary can make a difference. And then they should have a team of people who can be, not to use a military term, but can be deployed to those places that are really struggling. And when those people who have the expertise to train people as to what to do, who have the expertise of how to use platforms like Ushahidi, who have the expertise to explain to people how to create events data from information that people might be sending them through their text messages, otherwise known as crowdsourcing of data. I think then we have a capacity that the Secretariat can provide to clubs all over the world, at a country level. Those people need to move towards building a nucleus in those countries. Maybe this is the wrong word, but maybe, you know, I work in a biology department at Notre Dame, even though I'm not a biologist, so sometimes I want to show people that I know a little bit about biology, right? Anyway, the nucleus of organizations, the nucleus of the clubs, there needs to be somebody there who can put together a system like the Foundation for Coexistence developed, and we'll be talking about that with my case study. But there needs to be a core group of people in a country who know how to respond to incipient violence, who know how people can struggle for justice, can struggle for what's right, can stand for better governance, and they know how to do that without using violence. They know how, you know, it goes back to this idea that conflict isn't necessarily bad. In fact, if there's no conflict and there's injustice, then you've got, in some respects, a bigger problem. Conflict isn't necessarily bad. It's a question of whether you want to deal with it in a constructive or a destructive way. If you want to deal with it with nonviolence or violence. And so there needs to be a nucleus of people that are developed in that country, assembled, and who work and focus on supporting the Rotary clubs who are in locations of a particular country where there is, the possible violence that would tear a country apart. They'll need to train people in the clubs, and then they'll need to establish an early warning and an early response system, just like this group in Sri Lanka did. And when they engage, this is the point I really want to make sure that everybody can understand this. It's taken me a long time to understand it. It's not a question of, as I was saying before, we don't need to shun people. We need to engage with people. It's not a matter of us, in a sense, bringing forward our own view of the world and implanting that in others. It's a matter of going and having a genuine dialogue. And many of you may have read Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And this is the key point, at least that I pulled from that book. It's a wonderful quote here about dialogue is a conquest for the liberation of people. It's not a conquest of one group over another. Now, this gets to my final part, and I just wanted to talk briefly about navigating the organizational challenges that I'm sure Rotary is facing and will face. First of all, the fact that Rotary has the action group option seems to me to be a really good one. You can kind of survey the boundaries of what's possible with an action group. At least that's my understanding of it. And I think it's great that you form that, because there are going to be some people who say, well, this is political. We're not political. And that's another one of my points. There's a big difference between being political and being partisan. In the international humanitarian world, I remember distinctly conversations at Catholic Relief Services when we started working on so-called peace-building projects, and we had the same response. We're not political. And we finally faced the fact that, in fact, we are political. We're not partisan. Big difference. We don't stand up behind a certain political party. We don't try to get certain people involved in, running for office or getting elected into office. But when we say that it's not right that, the Tamil people are being pushed off their land by Sinhalese nationalists in the northern part of Sri Lanka, and these people are made landless and homeless, that's a political statement. There's nothing wrong with that kind of politics. So I think there's going to have to be an internal dialogue. I'm sure there's already been some of that within Rotary. I think there needs to be a focus on the common good. There needs to be an emphasis on the fact that this is service. And finally, I use this terminology because of a theologian named Walter Wink. He wrote a series of books, a trilogy in fact, while he was at U.S. Institute of Peace. And one of the books is entitled Engaging the Powers. And in that book he talks about, the way that we need to behave, again, is not to shun people, it's to engage people. And Rotary can do that. Rotary can engage people. Engage people who may feel that violence is the only answer. Engage people who are hurting because somebody in their family's been hurt or killed. And then Rotary can intervene to try to prevent violence before it happens. And in this way, Rotary can do what it can do uniquely. Rotary itself, the membership, the organization, the vision, that's what is really unique for Rotary. And I don't want to be, maybe this will be a little bit provocative. I'm sorry if it is. But as I told Al, for Rotary to put a lot of money into master's degree programs that are kind of out there, we want you to promote peace in the world, to me, that's like a shotgun approach. Rotary has a potential for a rifled approach. It has the infrastructure. It has the people. And that's its greatest asset, much more so than its money. if you're going to spend money on this, spend money on the secretariat setting up the nucleus in those countries. And if you want to educate master students, then have them fill those roles. But make it directed. Direct it to this type of programming. It's not just about peace in the world. It's about the peace that Rotary can make happen uniquely. Anyway, I don't mean to preach, but thank you.
So I will step up here with Joe, and I will be receiving questions from the audience here and also from the audience who is online. And I will direct them to you, and then you can comment on them.
Sounds good.
Okay, the first question is, should Rotary or the Rotarian Action Group for Peace collaborate with conflict resolution experts to deal with a rising issue?
Yes, I think, it's a little bit like, the idea if you can nip it in the bud early, you're going to be so much more effective. And I would say that's part of the whole reason that if you combine risk assessment with a secretariat and then you respond by supporting a country, the Rotary clubs in a specific country, I think you can get in front of the curve when it comes to problems. And so I think the early warning system in country is important, but more the risk assessment system at the secretariat level will help identify places where there's probably going to be a problem if something's not done. Right now there's an author, I believe his name is Sean O'Brien. He published an article, I believe it was in 2007. He's at one of the defense universities. I believe he's in the Army, I can't remember which, but the methodology that is out there right now is 80% accurate 5 years out. 80% accurate 5 years out. Now that's to me that's amazing. Now it's using a lot of pretty sophisticated mathematics, but they've gotten to the point where we're that accurate. Another interesting point, the British government's Prime Minister's Strategy Group did a study on risk assessment and early warning, early response. And their conclusion was that even if your warnings are false sometimes, if you intervene, when you intervened, there would have been extreme violence 1 out of 4 times, it would be cost effective if you were only that accurate. There's so much loss of life, of human suffering, of economic devastation that occurs when there's violence, economic meltdown, that if countries really did do early warning and response, and they had the capacity to do that, if they were only accurate that there would have been violence 1 out of 4 times, it would be cost effective. So you compare those two, 80% accuracy, 5 years out, cost effective, and this is for governments, who are expensive, and peacekeepers, expensive. It would be cost effective even if there would only have been violence 1 out of 4 times.
Connected to that question, Joe, you talked about the Peace Fellows, and in terms of conflict resolution experts, could those be the ones that would be involved directly? That is a follow-up question on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't mean to say that the Peace Fellows program isn't worthwhile. I think it's a great thing. I'm just saying that don't just educate some people to be peace builders for the sake of peace. Educate people to be peace builders for the sake of putting them to work on this. It should be a more again. It's like the difference between using a meat axe and a scalpel. I mean, focus your programming on what it is that will enable Rotary International to be the most effective it can be on this. And I know that there's a certificate program that you've got. I think that's a great thing. Maybe that's what you'll do in country. Maybe the training that's done by this nucleus of an organization in country would do certificate programs. In the literature on using crowdsourcing, the question is, in building a network of people that you can trust. They call it a trust network. Well, Rotarians should be that network. But they need to be trained, and you need to be able to count on the information that they send in. Their crowdsourcing should be something that you don't even need to verify because you know who they are, you know they've been trained, and you know you trust them. Mostly in crowdsourcing situations, you don't know who's sending it in. You don't know whether you can trust them or not. So you have to verify that information before you even post it onto an internet-based platform like Ushahidi. If you have a trust network, if you have Rotarians who have been trained, then it's possible to be much more effective.
Okay, the next question is, Joe, what do you think of Rotary specializing in early warning and then to be key in requesting early response from both Rotarians and other participating organizations like the United Nations, Nonviolent Peace Force, American Friends Service Committee, and others?
I think that that's exactly what it should do. I mean, this is not something that Rotary ought to try to do all on its own. If there are other organizations out there who are allies, by all means. I mean, I would work with them. In Sri Lanka, the Foundation for Coexistence worked with the Nonviolent Peace Force, worked with, there was a group from the Scandinavian countries called the Sri Lanka Monitoring Mission. And those countries they were there to monitor the ceasefire agreement that was in existence. And, you know, they would drive out there in their little Toyota pickup, four-wheel drive pickup truck with a huge flag, like the size of almost like the size of a bed sheet, SLMM, so that people knew that they weren't belligerents. And they would oftentimes stick their nose into things just to be an international presence so that there wouldn't be conflict. Well, those people are allies. I mean, we're always going to have people like that to work with. I think Rotary is the one that brings institutional staying power. You know, a lot of these organizations are working on the basis of paying people, of having enough revenue coming in. Rotary can operate with its members. You know, you're not going to pay your members to do this. This is part of the service of Rotary. You can operate with a lot less money than a lot of other groups can, and you can be much more widespread, much more penetrated in terms of your relationships. I guess that's what I'm saying. Rotary has this, you know, looking at it from, you know, somebody that after going through what these people did in Sri Lanka, seeing what Rotary can do, it's amazing. Their unique potential.
Here we have a comment that was sent from a Rotarian in Israel, and I will briefly read it and ask you to comment on that.
Okay.
Then. I live in Jerusalem, which is in a profound conflict zone where the horizontal networks of clubs is broken. That is, there are barriers to horizontal communication, fellowship, service, and peace-building activities between the Rotary district and the region. Israel, Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, Egypt. These districts make up a Rotary zone, but depending on who is hosting the regional meetings, boycotts can occur. This year, our Arab Rotarian neighbors are systematically boycotting the November Zone Institute, which will be held in Jerusalem. My district in Israel has gained international Rotary support and resources, vertical, but no support from the Rotarians in that actual district, Palestine, horizontal. I believe that exposing our lack of horizontal linkages could encourage dialogue and intervention, and I am hoping that your seminar can have an immediate positive impact in our region. I can leave that for you.
Thank you. You know, this is really an excellent point, and it's an excellent question. There is a human tendency, I think, for people to not want to work together with those if the Palestinians and others in Arab parts of Israel the West Bank, Gaza, the surrounding Arab countries, you know, they have the sense that the government of Israel is letting the settlers do what the settlers do, that the government of Israel is occupying that land, and that it would be fundamentally wrong for them, therefore, to collaborate with Israelis. And this kind of goes back to the point that Paulo Freire was making in his book. It's about engagement. It's not about shunning. And a lot of people, and I know personally from living in Jerusalem, a lot of people feel like, well, you really should not. Let me put it this way: I taught at Hebrew University as a visiting professor when I was there working for Catholic Relief Services because it helped me understand the Israelis better. I mean, I enjoyed teaching anyway, but it helped me. My students were predominantly Israelis, most of whom were Jewish, some of whom were Muslim. But it helped me understand them better. But in that setting, it was so pervasive among international organizations to not even feel like they wanted to interact with Israelis. And look at the Israeli groups out there that are working for peace. So can Rotary help bridge those gaps to overcome that barrier? I think absolutely Rotary can. I think they should be challenged to. You know, sometimes when I talk with my students, I tell them there is a role in this kind of work for the naive outsiders. People who come in and say, oh yeah, you can work together, and they're sitting there like horrified, right? Horrified. But sometimes outsiders, and that's why you need to look at, you know, outsiders and insiders at all levels. Sometimes the outsiders can really have a huge impact in some respects because they think things are possible. The people on the inside really don't.
The next question is, how do you engage an extremist who says, my way is right and your way is wrong?
That's a great question. I think that there are some extremists that you can never really have a transformation with. And if those extremists are propagating violence, if they're trying to promote violence, and there's no way to work with them, I think they should be thrown in jail. I think sometimes you have to do that. Of course, that's up to the government there, but there are sometimes people who are just troublemakers, and they have to be silenced. And so that's another great question. I mean, I think those are very difficult things, but that's the only solution I can think of, because I know there are people like that, and yet I would hope that we could at least try to engage with those people. And as I had put on the slide before, it's important to engage with the extremists, to just act like, you know, those people are no good, those people are evil, to demonize them. Sure, they might be doing some things that are wrong, and, you know, you could say evil, but we all make mistakes. Who was it last night? We were talking about Dorothy Day and her book, The Long Loneliness. I was reading that book the other, not that I read it all that, you know, I haven't even read the whole thing, but I opened it up at a shelter in South Bend the other day. It's a Catholic worker shelter in South Bend, Indiana. And the thing that really struck me in that book was that she said, you know, on average, I make 7 mistakes a day. 7 mistakes a day. So I think sometimes people, they're upset with those who make mistakes, and we need to see that we all make mistakes. We all do stupid things. We all should be ashamed for some of the things that we did, but we've got to move beyond that.
Okay, the next question. We had a State Department officer pretty much tell us to stay out of their business. Is that what Rotary is going to be up against?
You know, I've never seen anybody at the State Department do that. I guess I can imagine in a situation where there's a lot of negotiation and diplomacy going on. I think it's just like with anything else. The issue there is to identify allies, You're going to need allies within the State Department. You're going to need allies within the government of the country that you're working in. You're going to need allies in the police departments that are there. You're going to need allies within the UN organizations. I think you're always going to have people who are, oh, this is our territory, or people who, oh, don't be naive, or whatever. You're going to run into those all the time. I would say, you know, think of in a Aikido situation, right? You know, the martial art Aikido, where you don't, in many of the martial arts, you don't meet force with force. You know, you step, and you know the force goes that way, and then you move on. So I would not let those kinds of comments or those kinds of people get in the way.
Please comment on the importance of elevating women to equal status in cultures all around the world if we are to have a peaceful world.
Well, I think that, you know, in a lot of places it's been amazing what role women have had in preventing violence. I can't remember, maybe somebody in the audience knows of it, but there were women who, I think it was somewhere in Africa, but they told their husbands that there would be no sexual relations until they stopped fighting. And the government's, was it Liberia? Okay, so, I mean, women have a really unique role to play in situations like that and in a lot of other situations. So, you know, I think that sometimes there might be I think that getting women in positions of authority is also something that can help in a lot of countries. And helping women who are mistreated is also critically important. So I think it's a good question.
Okay, and for the sake of time, we will not be able to go through all questions. We will collect them all, and I hope Joe will agree while you're on the spot here to answer them afterwards, maybe when we communicate online, so we can really get to all the questions, because they're all excellent, and I was not trying to filter anything here. But the last one then for now would be, in the United States, and in the case of this viewer, so someone from our online audience, U.S. Virgin Islands, guns and gang violence is the issue. Can you talk about how early warning can be applied to our situation?
Well, I mean, we were talking yesterday about how violence is really the biggest disease in the United States. We have an epidemic of violence in this country. Yes, there are police departments that are using early warning and early response. They're using crime data. Their crime data are their events data. They keep track of trends. The one that I'm most familiar with, the system that they're using, it's called Hunch Lab. It was developed by a group called Azavia. They're based in Philadelphia. Robert Cheatham is the leader of that organization and a brilliant mathematician and strategist. There are programs such as Cure Violence in Chicago, where they are working with former gang members to intervene before violence happens. They did a documentary movie called The Interrupters. It's worth watching. There is a group at John Jay School of Criminal Justice in New York. David Kennedy is the leader of an initiative, they call it Operation Ceasefire. The book called Don't Shoot that David Kennedy wrote is well worth reading, because it'll give you a real good sense as to how to deal with violence in inner city America, or Virgin Islands as far as that goes. Protectorates, or whatever the category is. Anyway, I think there are methodologies, and I think early warning and early response absolutely can be useful in helping us deal with the epidemic of violence.